This is Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
Tonight, The View from the Hill. We're live on Capitol Hill after a packed day of congressional hearings with lawmakers digging into monetary policy and putting Trump's picks for Attorney General and Intelligence Chief under sharp scrutiny. All this against the backdrop of an escalating war with Iran, the U.S. launching yet another round of strikes within the last few hours. And we'll bring you conversations with lawmakers throughout the hour. From Capitol Hill this evening to our audience on Bloomberg TV and radio worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. And Joe, of course, we're here in the Russell Senate office building because a lot of other people spent time in the Senate today, including the Fed Chair, Kevin Warsh, as well as Todd Blanche, who, of course, is the nominee to be the next Attorney General, and Jay Clayton, who the president has tapped to lead the Office of Director of National Intelligence.
Yeah, it was a pretty dramatic day up here, as a matter of fact, as we all watched hours of testimony, not only drama, but some tension between Democrats and Republicans in the way that they handled the president's nominees for DNI and for Attorney General, with some tough questions about everything from the anti-weaponization fund that the president apparently still would like to keep the door open to the Epstein files. And as we begin this hour with testimony today on Capitol Hill, it's something to consider, Kaylee, that both of these gentlemen you mentioned, Blanche and Clayton, are expected to be confirmed.
Yeah, I guess it becomes a question of just how tight the margin of those votes are, because even some Republicans didn't sound satisfied by their testimony
today. That is true.
Today.
Two in particular, Tillis and Cornyn, when it comes to the Blanche testimony, of course, at odds with President Trump for political and personal reasons. President Trump's acting attorney general, who we're talking about here, Todd Blanche, took questions from lawmakers for several hours, and he was pressed specifically on his relationship with the president. Listen.
Are you and President Trump friends?
I'm his lawyer, was his lawyer, and now I'm the Deputy Attorney General. So I met him as his criminal defense attorney. I'm not sure there's very many people who have ever had a criminal defense attorney who calls that person their friend. I now have a...
Well, let me put it this way. Are you enemies?
No, we're not enemies at all.
Joining us now for more is Jonathan Tamari, congressional reporter at Bloomberg Government, who's up here every day, and it's nice to meet you here in the Rotunda. Jonathan, thanks for meeting us. How close could this be for Todd Blanche?
It's going to be really close in that Senate Judiciary Committee. They can essentially lose no votes on the Republican side to get him through. He's not going to get any Democratic votes. They were very unimpressed with him today. And there's two Republicans you got to keep an eye on. I think you mentioned John Cornyn, Tom Tillis.
Yes.
Both of them said afterwards that they were impressed with Blanche. They like Blanche's credentials. They have serious concerns about this anti-weaponization fund and about the immunity that President Trump has gotten from the IRS. They're both very concerned about Blanche signing off on that, and they say they want some kind of law, something in writing that would confirm that that weaponization fund is dead, and not just Blanche's word. Cornyn even said that because it's still in writing that there's a legal settlement around it, he's concerned somebody could sue for breach of contract if Blanche tries to say it's dead. So they're looking for something. They're kind of keeping their powder dry. They signaled they could vote for him, but they want something before they get to that point.
Okay.
Of course, the assumption with Todd Blanche was that it was always going to be almost impossible for him to win Democratic support. The same wasn't said for Jay Clayton when he was tapped to be the next director of national intelligence. You had Democrats at that time praising him, but some of those very same Democrats, I'm thinking of Senator Mark Warner here, seemed a little bit more unimpressed when it actually came to the confirmation hearing testimony.
Yeah, I mean, he basically had a task of not losing votes today, and I'm not sure he met that goal because his answers on the 2020 election really infuriated Democrats. I talked to Senator Mark Kelly about this, and he said, listen, if this guy can't tell us in the room that the 2020 election was legitimate when Donald Trump is not even in the building, how's he going to handle the president who's in the Oval Office facing across from him?
And Jonathan, sorry, we're having a little bit of difficulty with your audio, but he's speaking very well to this point here, which is that, frankly, both for Todd Blanche and for Jay Clayton, what Democrats were pressing them on was the issue of independence from the president and to what extent they would be willing to operate within their roles going against him if necessary at certain times.
That's for sure. We'll play this for you a little little bit later on in the broadcast, there was an extended back and forth with Senator Jon Husted in which he would not say who won the 2020 election. And when pressed by other lawmakers, and I believe it was Senator Warner, who we referred to earlier, he would only say that Joe Biden was certified to be the next president. So we're still hashing this out in 2026.
Yeah, something else that's still being hashed out on Capitol Hill as we speak is the funding request that this administration has handed down to Congress when it comes to the Pentagon in particular. They're trying to get through $73 billion in funding via the budget reconciliation process. But of course, the president would like to see a $1.5 trillion defense budget, in part to shore up the defense industrial base, which is actually what he was talking about today in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where he attended the Pennsylvania Defense and Innovation Summit. And that is where we find our colleague, Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall. Tyler, talk to us about what you heard from the president, what you've heard overall at the summit today.
Well, Kaylee, as you're mentioning, this summit was really about President Trump trying to push the U.S. and companies to help invest in the defense industrial base, made perhaps more urgent by the conflict in Iran, as CENTCOM confirmed at 3 p.m. Eastern that the U.S. was conducting its second wave of strikes today, designed to degrade Iran's ability to target commercial shipping. And then breaking just moments ago at the top of the hour, we got this confirmation from the U.S. military that they are enforcing that naval blockade, saying that they have already turned around an unladen oil tanker that was attempting to sail towards an Iranian port. This is on the heels of that Wall Street Journal reporting earlier today that President Trump is leaning toward expanding military operations when it comes to Iran, though hasn't made that decision quite yet. But it's definitely raising questions here about the timeline, what is going to happen next, and what does that mean when it comes to straining U.S. stockpiles and the military's resources. I had the chance to catch up with Republican Senator Dave McCormick of Pennsylvania, who is throwing this very summit that we are at here today, about what those challenges look like when it comes to what's happening next. Can you walk me through what are the biggest bottlenecks that you're seeing when it comes to the need to boost our defense industrial base?
Well, a big part of this is that a lot of the defense spending is facing backwards. It's on old platforms that haven't kept up with the times. And when you think about defense, if you're not careful, you can define it too narrowly. We learned during COVID, for example, that the pharmaceutical supply chain was dependent on China, that semiconductors were key to not only our vehicles, but our military equipment. So in Pennsylvania, we have 190,000 people that work in defense. We have 9,000 companies that make 435,000 parts for 2,900 weapon systems. So making sure that we have precision machining, making sure we have powdered metals, making sure we have the next generation components for satellites is really critical. And so making sure that's robust, making sure that this new technology is integrated into our platforms, and making sure that we have a healthy system that creates competition. One of the big problems is our defense procurement has really been a disaster. It takes too long. There's no long-term commitments. It's very boxed out for emergent technologies. So we need to streamline that. The Trump administration, President Trump and Secretary Hegseth have focused a lot on eliminating red tape and creating competition. This effort's meant to double down on that path.
And part of adding to the urgency is the conflict in Iran.
For sure.
The U.S. has used, at least by our analysts' estimates at Bloomberg Economics, at least 850 Tomahawk missiles during the conflict, but the U.S. only produces maybe 100 per year. You sit on Senate Foreign Relations, which has jurisdiction over foreign military sales. And I'm wondering how you're thinking about the U.S. using the leverage of international demand to help bolster its own stockpiles here at home.
Oh, absolutely. I think first of all, we have existing stockpiles. We've expended some of those in Iran, but we're still very well armed for any future conflict. But what it has revealed is that because the nature of warfare is changing, we need to have drones and counter drones and counter missile, anti-missile capabilities that are much cheaper and that we can build at mass production. So that's part of what we need to do. We also need to make sure that the next generation technology is integrated into those systems, and we need to spend more money. We need to, if you think of the defense budget as a pie chart, the pie chart's about $900 billion now. We need to increase the pie chart which unfortunately the Democrats voted against yesterday, but I would vote to continue to expand the pie chart. But we also need to reconfigure how the money in the pie chart is spent. And a bigger percentage needs to go to these emergent technologies, next generation warfare, and that's what the Trump administration is trying to do. A good example of where we've let things to apathy terribly is shipbuilding. I mean, our shipbuilding capacity in the world is less than 1%, but now based on what President Trump has done and the focus, we're going to go from 1 ship a year to 20 ships a year in the Philadelphia shipyard. Hanwha, a Korean firm, bought that shipyard, but we're doing all the things we need to do to support that in a way that it grows our marine capability, our naval capability, but it also creates 5,000 new jobs.
We actually just sat down with the Hanwha CEO. Since you brought up defense spending, you mentioned Senate Democrats moved to block the NDAA, the Pentagon policy bill that would authorize $1.15 trillion when it comes to defense spending. Where do you think those levels are actually going to land when it comes to what will be appropriated to the Pentagon?
It'll land what they asked for. We did a supplemental last year that was $350 billion. I think it's reasonable in this moment of profound change and risk in the world that we would increase our defense spending. And people will say, well, we spend more than any other country in the world. That is true. We're also the most prosperous country in the world. We're also the country that actually needs to secure itself against these threats from China, from Iran. So I think the proposal the president has is a good one, and I support it. But we need to make sure that, again, within that pie chart, that we're reallocating to this next generation of weapons and technology.
Related to this, so it's my understanding that $350 billion in the mandatory spending would be through the reconciliation process. Is there appetite to get through another reconciliation package?
I'm for it. I hope so. So the House has been discussing a second or third reconciliation bill. I'm hoping that we will have a chance to do that, and I'm hoping we could potentially deal with defense there if we don't get the support, but also the Save America Act, which is what the Speaker said, but there's some possibility of putting components of the Save America Act in reconciliation. I wish we could get 60 votes to do things that seem uncontroversial to me, but if we can't, the reconciliation process is a good path.
So you wouldn't be concerned that so many of the core priorities for the Pentagon, like munitions, would be done through reconciliation versus budget?
I'm concerned. I'm more concerned about us not having what we need to secure our country. So in a perfect world, I'd like to go through standard appropriations process, but I would be in favor of reconciliation to meet the needs of our military and to do things that seem so basic, like voter integrity. And
then just quickly on the current events happening here, we're seeing the U.S. move to reimpose the naval blockade. The other week, the U.S. Treasury Department revoked that license that had allowed Iranian crude to flow to market. What are you making of the administration's position to tighten the economic pressure at this point in time, also keeping in mind the fact that we know that there has been inflation linked to the Strait of Hormuz, and that's weighing on voters as we head into November?
Well, I like the actions the president's taking. I think it's consistent. I think if you follow the storyline, we took military action and economic action to try to encourage, incent Iran to give up its nuclear program and not to mess around with the Strait of Hormuz. We gave them a fork in the road, a path to a peaceful resolution through the MOU, or continued economic and military pressure. Unfortunately, they don't appear to be willing to negotiate at this point. We'll see. I haven't ruled that out entirely. So I think reimposing the economic sanctions, the blockade, and also selectively using our military to put added pressure on is a good idea. What's different now than previously in terms of the effect on gas prices, which is a very real concern, I agree with you on that, is I think we've established that we can put a significant amount of flow through the strait, maybe not back to the original. Saudi and the Emirates have now created alternative channels for their natural gas or for their oil, and we in America are the most energy dominant country in the world. So I think our ability to buffer ourselves from the impact economically is pretty good. I know the president's concerned about that, but I think we're now in a place where we can probably have both things happen. Blockade, put the economic pressure on Iran, and still maintain reasonable gas prices here at home.
In the final minute I have you, part of the Trump administration's defense strategy to bolster national security has been to take equity stakes in private companies. This has included the Pentagon. I'm thinking about Trilogy metals, MP materials. The idea that the U.S. Would get directly involved in these companies. Do you agree with that strategy?
I think if the government, in some cases, I think it should actively get involved in companies on critical areas. Semiconductors is a good example. I would say that we need to do it in a couple of ways. Number one, we need to ensure that if we do that, it's only in a very select area that are truly consequential to national security. It's a slippery slope, so we got to keep the industries and the numbers closed. Two, we would have to do that in a way that is guided by a set of principles that no matter who's in charge, in other words, if the Democrats win the White House, they would take the majority in the Senate and the House, would we be comfortable with those same principles being applied? And that's been my position from the very beginning. So I think a lot of the deals the President's done or his team has done are consistent with that, but those would be the rules that I'd ask about for any future investments.
So does that mean Congress getting more involved with the vetting process?
Well, I kind of don't think Congress is going to help much on this, but I do think putting a set of circumscribed conditions around when the government's going to take equity stakes is going to ensure that should be the kind of thing for our national security. It doesn't really matter who's in charge. We should be able to agree that we need to support certain industries that are so critical to our security and that we can have living offshore.
All right. Republican Senator Dave McCormick. Senator, thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg.
Thank you. Good to see you. Thanks.
And our thanks to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall joining us from Pennsylvania with that important conversation. We're going to be hearing another important voice from the national security space here live on Capitol Hill from the other side of the aisle next, when we spend time with Rhode Island Senator Jack Reed, the ranking member on the Armed Services Committee. That's straight ahead on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew as we join you live from Capitol Hill on a very important day here with an enormous amount of testimony, dramatic testimony for President Trump's nominees for Attorney General and DNI, but also a raging debate over defense spending that we've been crystallizing throughout the day here on Balance of Power and on Bloomberg TV and radio. With us now to forward that conversation is Democratic Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, a U.S. Army veteran, ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and an influential voice in the national security space here in Washington, D.C. If it's true that this is your debut on Bloomberg, I want to welcome you.
Well, thanks, Joe. It's
from one New Englander to another. It's great to see you and welcome. So there was reporting this evening that President Trump had a meeting in the Situation Room yesterday in which he was presented with options that may include the seizure of Kharg Island, the bombing of Pickaxe Mountain, and the dedication of troops on the ground, specifically to seize Kharg Island and open the strait. Would those be moves that you support?
Well, no, I have not supported this effort from the very beginning. The president did not get the congressional authority to conduct a war, which he's doing, and he has avoided responsibility and accountability, not just to the Congress, but to the American people. He started off without a real plan, without really defined an achievable objective, and now he's just looking for some way to get out of this situation he created, and there aren't any easy ways. Land combat will be expensive, particularly in the lives of American soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen. And also, I'm not convinced that seizing those positions would stop the Iranians from continuing their efforts.
Well, you talk about the cost, yes, in human lives, but also in terms of our munition stockpiles that we have access to. We know a great deal has already been expended in this conflict. We just were hearing our colleague Tyler discuss that with your colleague, Senator McCormick. That is part of the reason why this White House and the Pentagon have requested $73 billion in funding for the war. Is there not reason for that if it means resupplying munitions that we may need for conflicts of the future?
Well, first, the Department of Defense has access to close to $80 billion from the reconciliation package we passed last year. And they should, I believe, use that money to resupply, to re-equip, to develop weapon systems. Again, this is just a result of a poorly planned and well executed, I must say. Our military is superb, But when the leadership is asking them to do things that cost us in so many different ways, and one of them, as you point out, is our precision munitions and our ammunition supplies, but they have a slush fund, if you will, of around $80 billion. I would go there first if I was the president, if there was the critical need he suggests.
Well, of course, that's just a drop in the bucket, Senator, to the $1.5 trillion that the administration is asking for annual Pentagon spending. And we're told that this has turned into a proxy, essentially, for Democrats to vote against the war, not so much as defense spending. Does this NDAA that's being debated right now stall? Does defense spending not get approved as part of the new budget?
No, I think the problem is that we do not have a top line for the appropriators, including not just defense spending, but domestic spending. What we've seen is a very aggressive and over $1 trillion request from the President for Defense, but significant cuts to programs that are absolutely critical to the American people. SNAP programs for food for children and other people. And until we get a balance, which we've always maintained in the past, then I think we're going to have difficulties clearing anything on the Senate floor.
Anything.
Well, I wonder if that includes nominations. There were two critical nomination hearings that happened today, one in the judiciary with the Attorney General nominee Todd Blanche, the other, which you participated in before the Intelligence Committee, with the president's pick to be the next permanent director of national intelligence in Jay Clayton. I know that he faced tough questions from you and your colleagues, and some of them centered around the 2020 election results specifically, but is he not a better option to have in DNI? Is he better than Bill Pulte, who's in there on an acting basis now?
Bill Pulte is statutorily unqualified to be the DNI. The statute clearly calls for significant intelligence experience. He does not have any. In fact, he's a political operative for the president based on many of his behaviors. So it's not a question of is someone better than Pulte. The question is Clayton up to the job?
And is he?
Well, I have serious doubts. He resisted serious questions about the results of the 2020 election. He seems to be someone who is just another Trump operative, not an independent voice. And it's clear that you need an independent voice. The example being when they unleashed Midnight Hammer months ago and they attacked the nuclear facilities in Iran, the Defense Intelligence Agency head was fired because he sent a report up based upon best information saying that we had not obliterated the Iranian nuclear program. And, of course, now Trump is claiming we've got to go in and perhaps even on the ground and get that program out. So this administration is, and I think Clayton is someone that will cooperate with the administration, cooperates a mild term. This administration is just interested in getting people who agree with the president, not people who are willing to tell him hard truths. That's one of the reasons why we're in epic fury right now in this terrible operation in Iran.
So just to be clear, are you a no on Clayton's nomination?
Based on today's hearing, but you also want to take into consideration every other possible factor.
Yeah, understood. I see you're wearing a Ukraine pin on your lapel with the American flag. And there's talk right now about a sanctions package that was, of course, pushed through from your late colleague, Lindsey Graham, actually seeing the light of day. This has been months, if not years, in the making. The president says he's behind it, but he wants to add Iran and Hezbollah. Will that happen? And if it does that make this more complicated?
It makes it much more complicated. I don't think the administration has devoted the kind of aid and assistance to Ukraine that the Ukrainian people deserve.
Yeah.
I was there about a month ago. They are valiant, creative, innovative people who are not only holding their own, in many respects they're turning the tide, but we need to give them more help. This original bill, which Lindsey submitted along with Dick Blumenthal, had 85 co-sponsors, I believe, in the Senate, which means it could have passed in a moment.
Absolutely.
And the White House refused to do that. And now as the president comes in and said, yes, we'll do it, but I want to do this, it'll just complicate the situation dramatically. And I think we should particularly with respect to Senator Graham, I think we should pass the bill as it's written immediately and then help our Ukrainian allies.
Well, a consequence of that potentially, if countries that would import Russian energy products could face a tariff of 100% and therefore are discouraged from doing so at a time where we're already seeing supply restrictions in the Middle East because of the war with Iran, could this contribute to even higher energy prices? What do you think Americans should realistically brace for?
Well, I honestly believe you're correct that if you shut off significant supplies of oil, then demand is constant, prices go up. If demand increases, they go up even further. That is one of the policy consequences, but I think that this legislation would send a very strong signal to the Russians that we're really engaging with the Ukrainians. But that's a consequence. Now, you know, the big price boost has been caused by the turmoil in the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz being closed. That is the president's initiative virtually alone. And people should understand that they're paying more for gasoline because he decided to undertake this operation, which I think was not only ill-designed, but a misplaced effort, a military effort.
Can I just ask lastly, as someone who served in the United States Army, you're a West Point graduate, you served in the 82nd Airborne, the iconic 82nd Airborne, which has been invoked as a potential unit to help seize Kharg Island,
yes,
as I mentioned a few moments ago. Will you take another swing at a war powers vote if this is full-on war?
Oh, I think we have to, because we need to give our forces in the field the full backing, which only can come if the Congress of the United States says, we're behind you. Yeah. We did it in Iraq. I was one of 22, I think, senators that opposed it, but at least George W. Bush brought it to the floor and said, I need your approval. And as a result of that approval, we were able to continuously fund the troops because we had committed them as well as the president. This is just President Trump's denial of constitutional authority, denial of the law, and his own, it appears, somewhat sort of off-the-cuff attack along with others in Iran. If you're going to commit American soldiers to a battle, sailors, Marines, it's best to get Congress to stand up and say, you know, we're with you.
All right, we will leave it on that note. Senator, thank you so much for joining us live from Capitol Hill this evening. Democratic Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And now we need to talk about domestic politics as well, Joe. A key domestic issue, in fact, immigration and ICE. After just one day, the Department of Homeland Security has abandoned its decision to halt most immigration traffic stops following the second fatal shooting by federal agents in just a week.
Yeah, the abrupt change following an intervention by the President Trump demanding that the department continue the stops despite Tuesday's fatal shooting of a man in Maine. Joining us now with the latest on this is Bloomberg's Alicia Caldwell. Alicia, have these stops already resumed?
That's unclear. You know, generally we don't hear a lot about these traffic stops unless something goes horribly wrong or there's video after a confrontation. So it frankly is unclear, but they've been going on, you know, since the start of the administration and really ramped up as the pressure has ramped up on immigration and customs enforcement officers and agents to increase the number of arrests, the volume of arrests on a daily basis.
Well, and when we consider that volume, what is the volume overall looking like at this point in time, Alicia?
You know, it's a bit unclear, but there's, you know, reports of hundreds of arrests, you know, daily now. That we've really stepped up in the last few weeks. The administration has said, you know, over the course of a couple of days at the end of June, I believe, into early July, there were approximately 10,000 arrests. The goal last spring was 2,000 arrests a day. That's not happened, but they've certainly ramped up the number of arrests on a daily basis since we saw, frankly, a slowdown after the shooting deaths of Renee Good and Alex Petty in Minneapolis amid a surge of enforcement there. They sort of changed tactics, returned to a very sort of traditional approach of knowing who they were looking for, scouting out that individual, and then trying to pursue that individual. If anybody else was found, of course, they would make arrests in that case as well, but they were targeting specific individuals. They say they're doing that again now, targeting specific individuals, but at least in the last two fatal incidents, the individuals they were looking for were not found. And in fact, those two men who were killed were not the people that immigration was looking for or even possibly aware of.
There's been a lot of question about the use of body cameras in some of these cases. Alicia, has there been any direction from the agency reminding officers of the agreement that was made here on Capitol Hill?
Not specifically. You know, there's a push now to have at least one agent or officer in an arrest team wear a camera. But of course, the broader push is to have every ICE agent and officer wearing a body camera at all times and have that activated as necessary. That's a push that has been ongoing since the Biden administration. So far, that's not happened. There was an initial pledge of rolling out more cameras in a more broad way after the Petty and Good shootings in Minneapolis in January. But so far, that's not happened. And as we know now, there was no body cameras worn in the last two, I believe, the last two shootings. Certainly in Maine, there was no camera footage available from the government.
All right, Bloomberg's Alicia Caldwell, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, Joe, as you allude to, the body cameras issue was part of what was a list of reforms Democrats were asking be brought to ICE in exchange for reopening the Department of Homeland Security, which was shut down for a record length of time. Obviously, that shutdown is over. Democrats didn't extract many of the concessions that they wanted. But now, as we approach the August recess, we also have questions as to whether or not there could be a shutdown at the expiration of this fiscal year on September 30th, as lawmakers here on Capitol Hill try to get their heads around the appropriations process and defense appropriations in particular. So it's on that note now that joining us is Republican Senator Jon Husted of Ohio. He is a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee and is here live with us on Capitol Hill. Senator, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's so nice to have you.
Great to be with you.
When we consider this prospect, there's Budget Reconciliation 3.0 that is trying to get some funding to the Pentagon, and farmers, for example, go through a partisan process rather than the typical course of appropriative action. What's the real prospect of the full appropriations process being completed for the federal government by September 30th? Or do you see us barreling toward a potential shutdown?
I think that Chuck Schumer is setting us up for a shutdown. He's really, frankly, not been interested in negotiating on an appropriations bill. They continue to move the ball down the field and set up unrealistic expectations. I really think he's just trying to set it up to close it down. And we need to be well aware of that. And frankly, I hope we should go through the process as best we can. Susan Collins should lead us through an appropriations process, see if we can get Democrat votes. But I think that there's very little prospect that they will do that. And that's why I encourage us to consider taking up a continuing resolution very early in the process.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you, Senator. A lot of folks are kind of amazed that we're having this conversation right now. I don't even like saying the word shutdown out loud until it's real, because there's so much scar tissue from the last shutdown, which set an all-time record. Does a CR seem out of reach? If Democrats don't want to engage with Republicans, can we at least kick the can?
Look, they don't want to engage with us. They don't want an appropriations bill. And so what I'm saying to my colleagues is let's don't run this up to this. Let's not fool ourselves. This is not going to happen.
Instead of midnight on September 30th,
let's just do it now. Yeah. Let's just get a continuing resolution.
Could you pass it?
And pass it. I think we could. Now, understand, I don't want to say that to undermine the appropriations process. Of course. Let's try. Let's have some votes. Let's see if we can get some bills passed. But let's not set ourselves up for failure. If the Democrats are not serious about this, let's pass a continuing resolution. Let's hold an election, and we'll move on.
I'd like to ask you about defense appropriations in particular, as the president has obviously requested a $1.5 trillion defense budget. He suggested some $350 billion should go to the Pentagon via reconciliation. It seems that the number, at least coming out of the House, is going to be smaller than that at $73 billion. But how much money do you think this Pentagon realistically is going to be able to get, knowing Democrats, and we just spoke to one of your colleague, Senator Reid, do see this funding as kind of a proxy on control over the president's decision-making when it comes to Iran?
Yeah, it's all part of that conversation. I think it remains to be seen about how much the Democrats will be willing to work with us on any of this stuff. Understand, you have to have 60 votes to get this done. a reconciliation process just got harder with the passing of Lindsey Graham, who was the budget chairman. All of those things are extremely complicated.
Well, that's really something to consider. Is this art of the deal when you hear $1.5 trillion? Does the president offer that number thinking that it might be $1 trillion or 1.2? What do you see as the end game in this debate? That's a 50% increase.
But that's why you have conversations. The president proposes a number. We should have a debate and a discussion about what that money will be spent on. Remember, in the original working family tax cut plan that we passed last year, we added a lot of extra money for defense.
Yes.
And so let's have that debate, have the defense secretary come to Capitol Hill, talk about what they need, and then hash it out.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we know Secretary Hexeth will be testifying before the committee Tuesday, I believe, July 21st. When we consider the costs that he'll be talking about, when it comes to the reconciliation package in particular, they say that is the cost of prosecuting the war in Iran. That war is ongoing. The president has notified Congress of as much. We're seeing a third round of strikes this afternoon. Today alone, it's 5 days in a row. Are you comfortable with this potentially being open-ended in nature, no telling how long this will last or how much money will need to be spent?
Well, it's not really up to us on what the time frame is of this. We had a deal with Iran. There was a memorandum of understanding. They broke the deal. They're attacking civilian vessels in international waters, and we're trying to protect those civilian vessels. So Iran's not been a trustworthy partner for anyone in the world for 47 years, and we shouldn't expect that they're somehow going to see the light and all of a sudden become somebody that we can trust. We're going to have to find peace through strength. It's what America has always had to do when we've been successful.
So 2 quick follows on that, because the president says the same thing. These people cannot be trusted. He called them scum, and I think a lot worse in his most recent review a couple of days ago. If that's the case, then why are we fooling around with talks? Why not actually finish the job militarily? And if that is the answer, as Senator Jack Reed just said, why not have a war powers vote that supports the troops, codifies this mission, and applies money to the problem?
The issue with Iran is, of course, we don't know what they're willing to settle for. I think it's good to talk. Look, it's always good to talk. Let's set the parameters and try to find peace. But I mean, who are you talking to in Iran? The negotiators know more about that than we do. I just don't find them trustworthy. I think that you're going to have to, go, week to week on this until you can find some path forward.
Would you support an AUMF to actually codify this in law?
I think that the Trump administration, I hope President will do this.
Yeah.
Lay out what the path forward is.
Okay.
And then we can have a debate about what role Congress should play in that.
Well, maybe he will take the opportunity in his address to the nation tomorrow night that he's planning to talk more about Iran, but reporting indicates that he's going to spend at least some of that time talking about the 2020 election and the overall question of election integrity. And I ask you this knowing you were Secretary of State in Ohio, so you know how this works at the state level, operating the elections. Is there a dire emergency in this country around the ways elections are run? Are they insecure and unsafe? Because he's saying the Save America Act is absolutely necessary to address what he describes as an emergency.
It depends on which state you're talking about. We have 50 separate election systems in this country. They're run at the state and local level. In Ohio, we essentially have the Save America Act. We have photo ID. We do check to make sure that people are not in this country illegally and also on the voting rolls in our state. But in California, they don't do that. They send out unsolicited mail-in ballots where it's easy to cheat in a state like California. So election integrity is more important than some states and is in others, because some states have bad election systems, bad laws, and bad administration of those elections. In the recent California election, there's only local and primary election. It took them weeks to get the ballots counted. You can't have a modern system. You can't claim that you have a good system and take weeks to count ballots.
I want to ask you about the INVEST Act, which is something that you're working on and important to our viewers and listeners here on Bloomberg. Do you have the votes?
I don't know, but it's a problem worth addressing. Yeah. And what we're trying to do is I'm trying to protect capitalism. I understand that the federal government may find it necessary to invest in an American business For example, Intel, we know that the federal government invested in a chip maker. Okay, but I don't want it to be a long-term investment. I want strategic investments to be made. That's fine. We may need to protect the rare earth minerals, or we need to protect chips, or we need to protect some industry through federal investment, where you want the taxpayers to be the beneficiaries of that investment, not just the shareholders of the company. Perfectly fine. However, we don't want it to be long term. Yep. We have to have a divestment plan also connected to that. I have it so that it says if the federal government makes one of these strategic investments in a company, it can only be for 8 years, and then you have to divest within that time period. And then any earnings, any profit that we make from that should go to pay down the national debt. Mm-hmm. I think that's important. I want to protect capitalism. This isn't about President Trump. Whether it's President Trump or somebody else like Bernie Sanders, who might be president someday, I don't trust the federal government being a long-term investor in American companies. That makes us look more like China than America.
Really interesting. We'd like to stay in touch with you on that. Let us know how that goes, Senator. And it's good to have you as part of our conversation on Bloomberg. Senator Jon Husted of Ohio, we thank you for being with us. We've got a lot more ahead. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. We're live on Capitol Hill. Stay with us on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lines, live from Capitol Hill this evening after a busy day in the Senate, including confirmation hearings for two key picks of President Trump's to lead the Department of Justice. Todd Blanche, who, of course, has been nominated to be the next Attorney General, and Jay Clayton, the former chair of the SEC and former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, tapped to be the next Director of National Intelligence. Both hearings got contentious, and we want to talk about them now with this evening's political panel. As I'm pleased to say, joining us is Megan Hayes, a Democratic strategist and former special assistant to President Biden, alongside Greta Joins, Republican strategist and senior policy advisor at Brownstein Hyatt Farber Schreck. Welcome to both of you. I'd like to begin with playing a little bit of the hearing of Jay Clayton today. He got into a bit of a testy exchange with Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff of Georgia about who won the 2020 election. Listen.
Who won the 2020 election?
I'm not going to do this with you.
This is a job interview. We've established that you have an obligation to be honest and forthright with the committee. Yes, you do have an obligation to be honest and forthright with the committee?
Yes.
Who won the 2020 election?
Like I said, I'm not going to get into that with you.
But you do have an obligation to be honest and forthright with the committee.
Is anything that I just said not honest or forthright?
Yes, you're not being honest or forthright. Who won the 2020 election?
I think I've answered the question. We can keep doing this.
And Megan, we should note earlier in the hearing, he was asked about the 2020 election as well. He said he's not an election denier and that the election was certified for Joe Biden after 2020. And we don't have to relitigate that election in particular. But what does it tell you that Mr. Clayton had such a difficult time answering or refusing to answer the senator's question?
It tells me that they has one boss and he has to be loyal to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump will clearly not have the same respect for you. You won't be able to do your job as well if you don't say that he won the 2020 election or you say that Joe Biden won. It's really disconcerting that the head of our intelligence agencies would not just say that Joe Biden won the election in front of, under oath in front of the Senate.
Well, this is a briar patch. Greta, the president's going to be talking tomorrow in prime time, and reports say that he is going to get into the results of the 2020 election in some attempt to relitigate this. He will reportedly have some new evidence, is what we're reading. Does that effort undermine his effort to get the Save America Act taken seriously and passed into law?
There's been a lot of reports. I think we're going to have to wait and see what the president has to say tomorrow. I think he's going to cover a wide variety of topics. The 2020 might come up. He might also be forward-looking and focus on the SAVE Act. I think ultimately, what Senator Husted said before, that we have a 50-state election system. Some states do it really well. Some states do not. California being a prime example. I think there's ways to improve that system. And if the president focuses on that type of messaging, I think it'll be very interesting. I think it would be foolish to try and assume what the president is going to say. A lot of people who work for the president really don't know until the president starts speaking.
Well, if you were working for this president, Greta, and you were advising him as to what he should say if he's taking the opportunity to address the nation in a speech like this in prime time, should he not be making the case for restarting a war with Iran?
I don't think that the president wants to start a war with Iran. I think the president wants to resolve a war with Iran.
He wrote to Congress saying that it had resumed.
Well, he didn't say he resumed going to war. I think what the president is hopeful is that we get Iran into a position where they understand what their current situation is, and that the president is going to continue to use force to attempt to get a deal that benefits the people of Iran and the safety of the American public.
You worked for Joe Biden, of course, Megan. You know what it's like to use that venue of the White House in prime time. And it's something that this president has not done a lot. I'm not sure where he'll be tomorrow. He tends not to be behind the Resolute desk, but somewhere else in the building. Maybe he's in the Cross Hall. And what we understand is he wants to start a regular cadence of these primetime speeches. Is this a relic of the past? Who's watching TV at 9 o'clock at night waiting for the president to make an argument? And correct me if I'm wrong, but who is he actually reaching with these speeches?
I mean, I'm sure that the clips will live on social media. I think that the bigger question is, why are the networks carrying something that has been billed as an election denier speech and rehashing 2020? So if he doesn't start talking about why we're going back to war with Iran or how he's going to lower costs for the American people, I'm not sure why the networks would take it and why that they're going to cover lies. So that is a question that I would ask all of the networks in the coverage aspect of this. Getting a primetime address and getting those hours from the networks is a huge feat to do. It runs into their advertising dollars, and it is a big ask. When we did it, they were big speeches. When Obama did it, they were big speeches. So it's a good opportunity to be in front of the American people. But if you're just going to get up there and tell lies, I'd wonder why the networks are going to take it.
Well, we'll have to leave that question to others. I would point out, as Joe said, who's watching TV at 9 p.m. I would just hope a lot of people are watching TV, specifically Bloomberg TV, at 5 p.m. for this program and listening on radio as well, especially for a special edition like this one when we're on Capitol Hill. Of course, we're here today not just because of the confirmation hearings that took place, but also because there is a live debate here right now, Greta, around the appropriations process and around a third budget reconciliation package that could include $73 billion in funding for the Pentagon. It's a $95 billion package in total. There's money for things like farmers in there as well. What there isn't is offsets. And I wonder, without those offsets, if you think, Greta, there's a realistic chance of it getting through the House of Representatives.
I think that the president and Republican leadership, there are going to be challenges in convincing everyone to go along with this. Ultimately, this is a much more slimmed down package than was initially proposed when we first started talking about a third reconciliation bill. So I think there's a lot of members who are initially uncomfortable with that first number that I think will go along with the second.
Got a bigger number today, though, as it's now at $95 billion. Megan, what do you make of the conversation that we've been having with lawmakers here, and you've heard this as well? The Democrats are not going to approve any defense spending increases as a protest to the president's policies in Iran.
Yeah, I mean, why are we going to a war that the American people don't want to be in? Why are we spending more tax dollars with something that has not been laid out of why we are there, what is the end game, and how we are even going about it? He didn't start with the messaging in February when he went into this conflict, and it's gotten worse every day since. He said that there's been a ceasefire, 40 times at least, back and forth on this, and it's wreaking havoc on the American people and the economy. Gas prices are skyrocketing. The cost of food is skyrocketing. So I'm glad that the Democrats are going to stand firm on that, and I bet some Republicans will as well.
Well, it's not just defense spending we're hearing Democrats might stand firm on. There's been multiple suggestions, including from lawmakers we've spoken with and strategists like yourselves, that Democrats are going to have no incentive to approve any funding and avoid a government shutdown at the end of September. Megan, the thinking is that Democrats wouldn't pay the political consequence for that ahead of the midterms. Is that the right way to think about it?
Well, as you guys know, I don't think we should shut down the government if you don't have a way to reopen it. I think that the American people are tired of these shutdowns and the government not working for them. I think that's why you see a lot of these elections are anti-incumbent, both for Democrats and Republicans. But I don't think that Democrats will pay a political price come November for shutting down the government, because when you see this war that no one wants to be in and the cost coming back to taxpayers and back to the American people, they are going to blame the Republicans. They are the ones in power in the House, the Senate, and the White House.
One thing there does appear to be votes for in this Congress is sanctions against Russia, a sanctions bill that we understand might be named for the late Senator Lindsey Graham, having been the one to push this through. Greta, we're told that President Trump supports this, and he reportedly told Lindsey Graham that. But when asked yesterday, he said, when he was asked if he would sign it, he said, look, Lindsey was very big on this, and we might want to add Iran and Hezbollah as well. Do you believe that this will get to a floor vote and that the president will sign it?
I do. I think that these are important. I think the president wants to use the power of sanctions ultimately as part of his foreign policy. And Hezbollah and Iran are an important point that I think that we need to really take this time to ensure that we're not just focusing on Russia. We're focusing on all the global risks that are out there for America.
Well, and when we consider those global risks, knowing what Joe said, Megan, that the president would like to see other components added to this, Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island told us that that is a complicating factor. It could make it difficult to get through the Senate. Should Democrats not vote for it, even if it does include those changes, given the pressure it could apply to Russia?
I mean, I think that the Russia sanctions bill is very bipartisan. It has a ton of co-sponsors from both parties. And it's interesting to me because I believe part of the ceasefire agreement was lifting some sanctions off of Iran. So now saying that he wants those in there is a little bit confusing. But I'm not a person who thinks that we should not have sanctions. And I don't know why it would complicate it. I'm not sure why we would just let these people who are actually a threat to the United States not have sanctions.
Well, it could have been passed months ago. Megan, just quickly, do you believe the president would sign it?
I'm not exactly sure. I don't know. I would want to say yes, he would sign it, but I'm not so sure. As someone who wanted Putin and had Putin come to the United States, I'm not exactly sure that his best interests are with the American people on this one.
Didn't sign the housing bill either. Megan Hayes and Greta Joins, we thank you for the analysis and joining us. Wish we could be in the same room with you. On a busy day here on Capitol Hill, alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. Fascinating conversations, Kaylee, with the lawmakers this evening, and we'll be back for more tomorrow.
Indeed, we will. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. Of course, you can always check out more coverage in the Washington Edition newsletter, and we'll see you here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.